Welcome to Empowered. I'm Elizabeth Naumovski. Lately, we've heard a lot about ADHD, but what exactly is it? Is it a trend? And how does it affect anyone who's been diagnosed? And why does the way that we talk about it matter? Today, I'm joined by Sarah Ennor. Sarah is a public speaker and helps organizations and law firms understand neurodivergence so they can support their staff and reduce turnover. And she's also a lawyer and founder of Growth Counsel. Sarah's here to talk about ADHD and will explain why neuroinclusion matters. And guess what? Sarah was diagnosed with ADHD in March 2023. Sarah, welcome to Empowered.
Thank you very much. I'm so happy to be included in this really important conversation.
I'm really happy that you're here as well because you got diagnosed late. You were just diagnosed last year. How did you discover that? How did you discover this? And what did it mean to you? How did it change you?
Yeah, so I was 44 I am 44 still, when I was diagnosed, and it caught me a lot by surprise. I really didn't think that I had any sort of challenges related to ADHD at the time. So I had left my corporate career a number of years ago and planned to just figure out what I was going to do next, and very quickly realized that without the support and the sort of urgency and the structure that existed in the corporate world, that I wasn't able to move forward the way that I wanted to. So that sort of turned into a bit of depression, a little bit of anxiety. And at one point I was at a cocktail party, actually. Everyone asked if I was offended by this question, but I was asked whether I had a diagnosis. So I think that the person just observed that I was talking about my work and describing how I had all these great ideas, that I designed how I was going to move forward, and then never really executed, got overwhelmed, and started again a couple times over. Mm-hmm. And so she asked me that question. I got curious instead of annoyed and did a bit of research, asked for a referral from my family doctor, and was able to get a diagnosis really quickly. So that's how I found out about it. But the question about what it means is actually, I think, a really important one. I don't think my experience is very different from other people who have been diagnosed, but it really makes your whole life make sense. So even though I wasn't expecting it, to be able to look back and say, oh, that's why I behave this way. This is why I'm late for everything. This is why I interact with people and show my empathy in these ways. And then there's a little bit of a mourning as well, because you think, like, what if I had known so much sooner? Mm-hmm. What would have been the progress that I made if I'd known that?
Well, the good news is you weren't late to come here today.
No, I was early.
So yeah. I'm thankful and grateful for that.
I'm practicing.
And I love the fact that you said you were curious. You didn't get angry because that person had said this to you. Now, it seems to be very common for women to learn that they have ADHD later in life. Mm-hmm. And I know you and I were having this discussion. A lot of tests were done on men. But why is it that we're constantly being diagnosed later in life?
Yeah, well, I think it's a good time to introduce the concept of the stereotype of the ADHD boy, right? The little kid in grade school who's hyperactive and running around and has disruptive behavior. Because I think that's what causes women to sometimes be overlooked, is that they're not male. They're not necessarily hyperactive. They've been told to sort of sit still and behave themselves in class. And so they mask their symptoms really well. But women also aren't necessarily always hyperactive. Sometimes they're the inattentive presentation of ADHD, and so they might just be staring out a window and still being impacted with poor grades or other things within the school system. So we miss all of that, and I think society plays a role. We push through and we think, oh, I'm just supposed to keep it all together, and we do this well into adulthood without any idea, because we also think, I did, that it's hyperactive boys. Yeah.
So let's set the stage. We have less than a minute. Mm-hmm. Has it become trendy to have ADHD?
Well, if you look at trendy as what we're seeing in the news and written in papers and on social media, I think the answer is somewhat yes. It's in the news. We see diagnoses going up. We see women being diagnosed, adults being diagnosed, and medication being prescribed. And then we see people on social media really talking about their experiences a bit more. So definitely there's a lot going on in the public eye about ADHD.
Okay, so when we come back, we will talk more about ADHD and whether it is a trend or truth. And thank you to Sarah for coming here and expressing everything that she's been through. So please don't go away. More ADHD trend or truth when we come back. Welcome back to Empowered. I'm Elizabeth Naumovski. Today's episode, we're discussing ADHD, trend or truth. So, Sarah, why has this become a debate? Some people think it's a trend, some people think it isn't. And what's the harm of having differing opinions?
Yeah, well, I think that the debate really comes down to looking at, is this real? So we talked about the fact that there are so many more diagnoses we're hearing about in the news. But the timing kind of plays into it. So we've just come off the back of the pandemic and all of a sudden so many people are being diagnosed. Is that because there are more cases of ADHD, or is ADHD really just the same thing everybody's been going through while they've been isolated, and sort of those mental health challenges and things like that? So there's that. I think also sometimes there's a bit of a legitimate question as to whether or not doctors that are assessing people are actually equipped to do it. So, do they have the skill? Do they know how to apply the test? Are they making sure that they're ruling out all of the other comorbid things associated with ADHD? And so, yeah, I think it's, people just aren't sure whether it is really a condition, when I can tell you it definitely is. I wouldn't be here if it wasn't.
Okay, so what do you think is the biggest hurdle in understanding the condition then?
Well, the symptoms of ADHD are all kind of human experiences, right? So everybody has been late for something.
And they're unique, right? Or are they not unique and everybody has the same symptoms?
Well, so everybody experiences symptoms differently, but what I mean is the symptoms are actually things that other people that don't have ADHD will experience in their lifetime, right? Mm-hmm. So the hurdle becomes, if we have experience, for example, walking into a room and forgetting why you came in there, when someone tells us they have ADHD and they do this, we see the same experience, right? And so we think that they're experiencing the same thing that we are, mm-hmm. but it really doesn't get to the severity of what ADHD truly is. So I think that is the challenge. We all have that experience in some way, and so we overlay our own experience over what we're told when we hear about ADHD. And it seems just like human inconvenience. You're late, you're distracted, those kinds of things.
So what are a few key facts that we should know about ADHD to lessen the stigma?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think it's important to understand a few things that we don't see in the news very often about what makes it more severe than just the typical human condition. So one of the things is that you need to actually be impaired. In order to be diagnosed, you have to be impaired in 2 out of 3 major areas in your life. So that can be your social relationships, it can be work, school. And so there needs to be something that is above and beyond what the average person is experiencing day to day. The other thing is that this is primarily an inherited condition, and so it's lifelong. So if you've been overlooked as a child and you're looking for a diagnosis as an adult, you must be able to remember having had these impairments back before you were 12 years old. And so those 2 things kind of start to help you realize that this is much more significant than what we hear in the news day to day, that someone's just a bit distracted. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So what does having this condition mean in practice? And how does it affect someone day to day?
Yeah, so really it's our executive functions. So our ability to regulate our emotions or motivate ourselves or plan or keep our impulses under control or working memory, those kinds of things. So the one part of our brain knows we have to do something, but we're not really able to, the connection between that part of the brain and the part that makes us act is just not as strong as it is in others. So for folks with ADHD, what that looks like is where someone else would be motivated by a task being really important, or there being a reward or a consequence associated with it, someone with ADHD needs to genuinely be interested. So that can look like I'm talking about something novel. I'm looking at something that's complex. For me, urgency is the number one thing that gets me moving. It has to be on fire, then I'm going to act for sure. Or you can be passionate. So that's kind of how it plays out day to day.
So how would somebody know that somebody else has ADHD? Because you and I talked earlier, and we talked about the fact that somebody had said to you, well, how did your teachers not tell you?
Yeah.
So how is it that you went all this length without being diagnosed?
It just never occurred to me. Again, I pictured the hyperactive child. I thought that I was doing really well, and I was doing really well. I was successful. I was a senior lawyer. I had, great promotions and titles, and I did well in school. I was getting in 90s. Where's the other 2% was what my dad would always say when I came home with a test, right? Like classic dad. So, it doesn't occur to you. And I think that stigma actually that you were talking about really plays a role because no one wants to have that.
So hold that thought. We will be right back with more ADHD talk when we return. Don't go away. Welcome back to Empowered. I'm Elizabeth Naumovski. On today's episode, we're discussing ADHD, trend or truth. So Sarah, what are some of the ways that ADHD has actually impacted you in your life?
Well, certainly looking back at my career, I see a lot of ways that, the ways that I think about things have not been traditional. A couple of things that just pop to mind, and I mean, it would take us hours to go through all the ways I'm learning about how I'm impacted, but, my relationship with time is a great example. It does not exist, as it turns out. I was very lucky to be here early only because I was visiting family beforehand, but usually I would be running in at the last minute. I underestimate how long things will take. I underestimate how long it's going to take me to get somewhere and all of those kinds of things. But it also means that when you need something done on a deadline, I'm your person because I can really focus and be efficient when that happens. How I show empathy is another one. And this is something that really has been difficult for me a lot because I always thought I was a very empathetic and caring person. And yet I would notice that people didn't always respond to me that way. They thought I was all about myself and kind of selfish. When the traditional way, if you say, oh, I've had a bad day, would be for me to then listen to that and ask you more questions and sort of be patient with the answers. But for folks with ADHD and me in particular, I would rather lay out a bunch of common facts for you to look and sort of take from the menu. Where can we find that connection? And so that way of sort of connecting with people is just not as typical or traditional as others. So those are two really great examples of sort of relationship and just life impacts.
Okay, so I have to ask, you've got problems with arriving places on time, but you've got a watch, you've got a cell phone, you've got a calendar.
Yeah.
So can you not input it an hour ahead of time or 30 minutes ahead of time? Does that not help?
So I have a calendar that warns me a day before, 2 hours before, a half hour before, and 5 minutes before, all of it.
Okay.
And if I were to show you my watch right now, you would see the pile of notifications sitting there. And so part of it too is it becomes less interesting, right? Once I've seen it once.
Because there's too much.
Yeah, exactly.
There's too much for you to absorb.
And it's too similar. Like I've seen that before. I'm not necessarily feeling like that's important anymore because that's just the same way that it always appears on my watch. So I'm trying things like getting a virtual assistant who actually contacts me before I have to leave for something and says, you have 30 minutes, you've got to get on the road right now. So keeping it fresh can really help, I think, but that's an effort to figure out how to switch it and when to switch it as well.
Yeah, I can see that because if you look at the calendar, all these alerts, you just push them away then, right? Yeah, okay, that's tomorrow, that's in an hour, that's in 2 hours or whatever.
That's what the snooze button's for.
Right.
Yeah.
And so it actually is ineffective rather than helpful.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. So
good to know.
So what are some of the ways that ADHD has impacted you? I know we've talked about empathy and we've talked about time, but what has it done to impact you?
Well, if I look at sort of the impact to my career, for example, when I look back at the feedback that I received, I can almost map every single constructive thing to part of my condition, right? I don't leave space for others to talk in meetings. I'm impatient. I cut people off. People don't feel like they're welcome to have a turn. And that's just really all about, first of all the ideas that are in my head all the time and trying to figure out how to get them out as fast as I can. And also just an impatience to wait for people to kind of get to where my mind has already arrived. And I don't say that to be cocky. It's just my mind is racing all of the time. And I think that's very common with people with ADHD.
Okay, so I have to ask you then, because, my mind's constantly racing. I'm always thinking and I never sleep. Do you sleep?
No. Not really. No, I was thriving when I was working in a big bank and sleeping 2 or 4 hours a night, right? And playing sports and going to meet friends and working all night. Like that is when I actually thrive. And insomnia is actually one of the physical, mental symptoms of ADHD as well, and that circadian rhythm being off. So I'm a night owl big time.
Interesting. Does working out help you out?
In theory, if I could get to the gym, yes, it absolutely would. But
on time.
That's not so much on time. That's just one of those things that isn't interesting to me unless I have a competition coming up or there's someone waiting and there's some reason that I have to get to the gym. It's just not interesting enough for me to go for a run or lift weights.
Okay, so what does help you?
Well, I would say certainly having people that are relying on me because my reputation is so important to me. So, coming here and I want to be on time for you, for example. But urgency is really what it is. If I prepared for this talk 5 minutes before I got here, you would get the absolute best result because I haven't thought about it at all, right? And I've had to do it really quickly and concentrated.
And so let's put that on hold because I urgently need to go to commercial break. So please don't go away. Welcome back to Empowered. I'm Elizabeth Naumovski. On tonight's episode, we're discussing ADHD, truth or trend. And I'm joined by Sarah Ennor, founder of Growth Counsel. So Sarah, if someone says they have ADHD or suspect that they have ADHD, what's the best response for them? What should they do?
So I think the first thing when we're thinking about how we react to someone who tells us this is to know what not to do. And so the biggest thing is really just trying not to make the stigma that already exists for them bigger, right? So I've often been asked, well, but you are a successful lawyer and how did you get through law school? Well, it's not true that people with ADHD aren't smart and can't be successful, right? Does everybody have a little ADHD? That's not factual. So trying not to increase the stigma, but what we can do instead, I think, is ask about how the person feels about their experience. How does this feel for you? If you've got this diagnosis, what does that mean? Listen to what they tell you. And instead of jumping into solving mode of like, oh, well, if you can't be on time, maybe you should set your alarm clock earlier or, things like that, where it just like you may not know exactly what the magnitude of their experience is. And then just really believe what they tell you. So ask, listen, believe, I think is sort of the mantra I'm trying to make go viral.
Ask, listen, believe.
Yeah.
Okay, I like that. So ask, listen, believe. Why is this important for you to share your experience now?
Yeah, well, anybody that ever has met me would say that I'm very overly confident at times and I'm an open book. And so if I am able to talk about my experiences and bust some of the stigma that comes with this condition, I think it's important to help make the condition human for people that have it, to know that there are other people out there that do and that are going to speak up. And then for people that don't have ADHD, to really understand what the human impact of the condition is, because that's what gives them the why to go from, should I even do anything about this? How should I accommodate? Is it okay to ask someone about the condition or should I? So yeah, just really making it human and trying to help folks to understand what it is.
Because I'm sure when you were diagnosed, you had a million questions. I'm sure that you were all racing through your mind. And so what was the first thing that you did?
Well, before I was diagnosed, I went to TikTok immediately. So I was listening to all kinds of little snippets that were hilarious and saying, this isn't really me. And then once I did have the diagnosis, the amazing part about it is it's really validating to be able to look back and say, oh, this makes sense. So that gave me a little bit more desire to do the research and read up on it and ask the right questions. But, it's important not to necessarily do that just among your friends and family because they may not know anything about it or they may be coming at it with that stigma that we've talked about so much in the conversation.
That's why I always talk about asking questions because we don't know everything, but we surround ourselves with people who know something that we don't know. Ask all the right questions. And even if you don't know the right questions, just ask simple questions and the right questions will come about. So one of the questions I have for you is, are there any risks associated with ADHD?
Absolutely. So it's a neurological condition, which I've now learned often is comorbid with a whole bunch of other neurological conditions as well as mental health. So, there's a higher risk, 5 times more likelihood that folks with ADHD will attempt suicide. 50% of them may have anxiety issues. A third might have depression. 2 to 4 times as many people may die prematurely because they're so impulsive or inattentive that they might have car accidents and other things. So there's definitely risks. And the good news is the faster we help folks identify the condition, the less these risks exist for them.
So, okay, if we're going to talk about risks, let's talk about upsides. We've got 30 seconds left, upsides to having ADHD.
Yeah, well, hyperactivity, when you look at the flip side of that, it's really that we have boundless energy. If you look at being distracted, that's actually a version of curiosity. We're explorers, we question things, we gather information. And when we have impulsive behaviors, that's also an element of creativity. We take risks and we really, say things that other people wouldn't have the courage to say sometimes. So I think it results in great decisions for folks with ADHD contributing.
Thank you so much for being here today, Sarah.
Thank you.
Life is not easy, whether it's your personal or business life. Whether we like it or not, we all struggle with imperfections and self-doubt. One of the key things that Sarah has expressed is that she doesn't always remember to trust herself. She can find herself crowdsourcing opinions to feel validated in making her choices. But right now, she's practicing self-trust. And the more she tries it, the more she realizes how trustworthy she actually is. These are great words of wisdom that we should all try to incorporate into our lives. I'm Elizabeth Naumovski, and I'm here to empower you and make frugality fashionable. Thank you so much for watching. Bye for now.